Good morning. It is Thursday, August 14th, 2025, 11:45 a.m. Eastern, 8:45 Pacific. Broadcasting live from Toronto. This is the Mothcast. Live look here from the CN Tower cam, looking down over Queen's Quay at the harborfront there. Looks like it's another sunny day out there. And then looking west towards the Humber River, the X grounds. Looks like it's going to be another sunny day out there. Smoke advisory currently in effect. Right now, at least some smoke in the forecast if you're in the GTA. Just to be aware, there is some smoke in the forecast coming from some of those forest fires up north. So just, take it easy, avoid strenuous activity. Mask up, usually a good idea. And what are we talking about this hour? We're going to be talking, it's going to be a bit of a shorter stream today. I know I'm quite late, and just a lot going on lately, and then had some technical difficulties getting set up here. So it'll be a bit of a shorter stream today. I'll go till about 12:30, and then we'll flip over to the majority report for the American story. What we're going to be mainly talking about today is the union representing Air Canada flight attendants has, as of yesterday morning, served strike notice to Air Canada. Strikes beginning on Saturday morning. So I guess if you have any flights coming up in the next few days with Air Canada, probably good to check on that, as cancellations have already started. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Thanks for tuning in. Or if you're watching on the VOD on YouTube, thanks for watching. You can always catch the VODs, usually up around 5 p.m. On the day of streaming, although sometimes it's like the next morning, depending on how the day goes. Hope you all have had a good week so far. Almost a weekend. We'll get right into things here. Like we mentioned at the top there, Air Canada flight attendants could be going on, or will be going on strike as of Saturday. The union representing about 10,000 flight attendants served strike notice to Air Canada yesterday morning. That's Wednesday morning, August 13th. Air Canada responded with a lockout notice sent to the union. So it looks like there will be, strike, service suspension, what have you, happening beginning Saturday morning at 1 a.m. Expect delays and disruptions, especially if you're flying to the U.S. or, for any, the Americans down south. Air Canada is one of the largest foreign carriers that services U.S. airports. But you know what? This is what happens when you do not, fairly compensate your workers. This is what happens. When work's not fairly compensated and the value that they generate is not properly acknowledged, then work stops. Logically. And this is the case of what's happening here with the flight attendants for Air Canada. There is a number of issues that are kind of in dispute, similar to what we kind of talked about with the postal workers, with the negotiations ongoing right now between Canada Post and the Postal Workers Union. The issue here is largely around pay. Part of it is just the pay itself is too low, or there is no pay at all. And the other thing too is just in terms of real wages, in terms of how far a dollar goes in our economy per inflation, and how that just affects buying power. That the any raise that Air Canada has offered has not kept pace with inflation, and thus ultimately means it's sort of still a wage cut, because the buying power, the rate of the raise does not keep pace with the rate of inflation, and thus the workers' buying power is cut, and so it's effectively still a wage cut, because it's not keeping up with the cost of living. To sort of kind of get a bit more into the nitty gritty, the one of the main things that's at issue here, like I said, is pay, and it sort of kind of operates in two ways. The first one, which I kind of recently learned about, but was not as aware of, and you may or may not be aware of this yourself, is how pay actually works for flight attendants. They're only actually paid for the time in the air. So while you're up in the air and you are getting your in-flight drinks or food, or they're coming around with towels or pillows, what have you, all that work is paid for. However, once the plane is on the ground, or before the plane leaves the ground, flight attendants aren't being paid. So they're not being paid for the boarding of passengers, greeting people, making sure luggage is stored securely and safely in the overhead compartments, addressing any particular passenger needs that are brought up in advance, like any sort of disability accommodation, or any sort of other just extra accommodation a passenger may need. The in-flight safety demonstration, and so any of that, or once you're on the ground, again, coming around, checking on passengers, making sure everyone is seated until the plane stops at the gate, helping passengers just deplane, helping people with bags, ushering people out of the plane, answering any questions about folks may have about where to go for transfers of if they're trying to make a connecting flight, that sort of thing. All that labor on the ground is unpaid. And so Air Canada had offered to instead pay 50% of flight attendant wage for pre and post flight duties while the plane is on the ground. The union came back and said, well, actually, you should just pay the full wage. They're still working. They should be paid, which I think makes sense. Just something to kind of keep in mind is that when when the plane's on the ground, when you're meeting the flight attendant, if you're going for a flight at the airport and you're meeting the flight attendants are at the gate or once you're on the plane, when you're seeing them going around helping people fit their luggage in the overhead compartments, that kind of thing, or assisting people in lifting their luggage into the overhead compartments for folks, old folks, just folks who just aren't, can't reach up there or what have you, all that is unpaid. And this has especially been an issue post COVID lockdowns, where sort of once flying opened back up again, starting like 2021, 2022, there were quite significant delays at airports, particularly Pearson. We were here in Toronto. Pearson Airport was the number one most delayed airport in the world, of the world's top 100 busiest airports. So more delays than Heathrow or O'Hare or blanking the Atlanta airport, which I'm blanking on the name of, or LaGuardia. Pearson was number one, and then I believe Pierre Elliott Trudeau was number two in Montreal. And with roughly half of all flights experiencing some kind of delay. And then this was as of 2021, I think, and then 2022, London's Gatwick took the top spot, but still at Pearson had only fallen to second place, but still, for every 5 departures, 2 were delayed, or a little more than 2, because it was about 45% of flights departing from Pearson were delayed. So that means the plane is stuck on the ground still, obviously. So these are, and delays can, sometimes it's a few minutes, sometimes it's a half hour, sometimes it can be a couple hours, depending on, how busy air traffic is, depending on, especially if you're coming in, if they can't get, how long it takes to get like a gate marshal, like the person with the wands that, guides the plane into the gate. Or if you're taxiing, how long it takes for to push back, because you need the little, I can't remember what that vehicle's called, but the little vehicle that comes around and attaches to the front wheel of the plane and pushes the plane back from the gate. Or who knows, like any number of reasons why is to, Air Canada cited labor shortages, Pearson cited labor shortages as a cause for so many delays, sort of in the first days of flying after the pandemic lockdowns. And so, that could be any number of things too, like not enough hands working on loading luggage into the, loading checked bags into the plane or that kind of thing. So that sometimes, you can be sometimes you can be delayed on the ground for hours. Or an hour, what have you. Point being, that is all unpaid time that the flight attendants are working. So that's all time that they're not being compensated for the work they have to do to help make sure the flight operates comfortably and safely. So, and even still, I was just sort of looking at some stats yesterday from Pearson yesterday, and about a quarter of departing flights from Pearson experienced some kind of delay. Was it departing? Or sorry, about a quarter of it wasn't departing flights. It was by airline. About a quarter of Air Canada. Air Canada flights experienced some sort of delay just yesterday, August 13th. And so, so the union, I think, quite fairly has said they should just be paid 100% of the wage that they would be paid. They are still working. They are still providing the airline value. Their role is still necessary in the in the sort of cabin experience, and so they should be paid. And the other thing too is, the actual rate of pay for flight attendants is not great. 75 hours a month is usually what's considered full-time for flight attendants with Air Canada. So that nets out to about 20 hours a week-ish, a little under 20 hours a week, about 18 and 3/4. And so before you reach full-time, the starting rate is about $26 an hour, which works out to about $23,000 a year. Or about $19.50 a month. So that's not even enough. Like if you live in Toronto, that's not enough to make rent, let alone like to pay first and last to move into a place, but just rent alone. When average rent in Toronto, I'm fairly certain, is well above $2,000 a month. And for, a 2-bedroom or 1+ den, it's getting closer to the neighborhood of $3,000. And it's a similar story, across the country, in Canada. So it's not even enough to like house yourself on. And then after 4 years, after 4 years, you move up to about $43 an hour, which works out to about $41,000 a year. So not great. It's about, I think it's like about $3,300-ish a month. So you can make rent, but still then things like, other household expenses like clothing, groceries, if you have a car, insurance, gas, if you have any payments on the car, utilities, internet, phone, that becomes a pretty tight squeeze when, probably at least 2/3 of your paycheck would be going towards rent. So it's not great, especially for, especially because, a lot of flight attendants end up working more than full-time in a month. They work about 80 hours a month usually. And it's important to keep in mind too, like, you'd probably think, 20 hours a week, that's, full-time is 40 hours a week. 20 hours a week is nothing, whatever. But you have to think about how this actually kind of meets out on when you're working on an airline, because it's not just like your typical, it's not obviously your typical 9 to 5. You are on that airline for the duration of the flight. So that means, it could be whether it's, a little commuter trip from Toronto to, New York or Ottawa, or you're on a long haul flight to London or Tokyo, which, is now you're looking at 6, 7, 10 hours, nonstop, where you are always on. There is no kind of break to get away or what have you. You are always on. You're working in a pretty tight, confined space. There's not a lot of space on anyone who's been on an airplane can attest. There's not a lot of space on there to move around, and you are always doing service with a smile, kind of thing. So you are always on, and then on top of that, you are also dealing with, especially for longer haul flights, you're also dealing with time zone changes and that sort of thing. Especially for if you're crossing the Pacific, you're crossing the date line, you're either like gaining or losing an entire day. And so that's going to mess with you. But even just flying across the Atlantic, when you're looking at a, 4, 5, 6 hour, 7 hour jump in time, that's going to also, have an impact. And so, so it's not a lot of pay for pretty hard work. And not always, it's not like regular, it's not regular hours either. It's, you may be doing back-to-back flights sometimes, or, you are, or just, you're on a long haul flight and then you're kind of stuck, away living out of a suitcase in a hotel for a few days before then you come back. And so it's just, just the sort of point being just to conceptualize that 20 hours, a week could be, in terms of, being an airline attendant is quite a lot. And who knows, like you may do 20 hours in, 2 days out of that week if you're doing some long haul flights. So, you could be doing, 10, 12 hour, maybe 2 flights, but it's 10 or 12 hours of consistent nonstop service for those 10 to 12 hours. And your wage is barely keeping up with cost of living. So that's sort of like, is often what's cited as sort of the primary grievance is pay, and the pay, like real wage or pay kind of relative to inflation. The Air Canada had offered, I believe it was an 8% pay raise, but with sort of with kind of the rate of inflation right now, at about what was it, about 9%. Where did I just have that figure? I believe it is. I believe it was in this, but so regardless, the pay raise offered fell short. Again, like what we saw with the Canada Post Union, the pay raise that was offered fell short of the actual rate of inflation by about a percentage or two, and so that was rejected because that's not keeping pace with the cost of living with the actual rate of inflation. And so negotiations sort of broke down between the CUPE's Air Canada Component and which is the union representing airline attendants, and Air Canada, because essentially negotiations had stalled, and this is coming from a bulletin on the CUPE website, that essentially negotiations had stalled largely on the lines of the issue of pay. And so what is sort of being kind of posited in the news, like in Reuters, was that that Air Canada had suggested going to binding arbitration, and that CUPE had said no, and that's where negotiations ended. In reality, as per the CUPE bulletin, what happened was that Air Canada basically walked away from negotiations, tried to go to the federal government to come down with legislation to essentially make a ruling or some kind of binding decision in Air Canada's favor to get to stop the to end negotiations, basically. And that's when CUPE walked away from the table, because Air Canada was trying to Air Canada was trying to infringe upon CUPE's right, as is a right in Canada, trying to infringe upon their right to bargain. And so CUPE served strike notice to Air Canada on Wednesday morning, with 99.7% of CUPE members voting in favor of striking. So a pretty decisive, just about unanimous strike vote. And so the strike is set to, as per the requirement of giving 72 hours notice, the strike is set to begin at 1 a.m. Saturday morning. So that would be 1 a.m. Saturday, August 16th. So pay kind of being one of the big pieces of this. The other two is just about kind of, not just, but about also working conditions, about scheduling and fatigue, about just, respect by management. Some of these kind of outlined in one of the CUPE bulletins. I just had it open. I accidentally closed a tab. That might be what I needed. But one of the things is one instance or one example noted by because right now CUPE is reaching out to their members and asking them to submit instances that they've experienced where Air Canada has acted, where the actions of Air Canada have contravened either the pre-existing collective agreement or other kind of labor safety regulation. One of which was that flight attendants were being compelled to board and work on a hot plane, which is a plane without the AC running, and especially we've had some hot weather these past couple of weeks. And like I said, those airplanes, those jets are pretty confined spaces. They're pretty tight, and without that kind of airflow going, which is only happens once the engines are powered up, that would be pretty uncomfortable, dangerous, and not conditions someone should have to work in. The other thing too is with fatigue. I mentioned that many flight attendants end up working more than that full-time 70 hours a month, and often will end up working 80 hours a month. And like I said, especially some of these are on long haul flights. This also means, they are subject to, or they're at, sort of, they're operating sort of, while they're exhausted and tired, which means that, when you're tired, you're not sort of as aware of what's going on, of your surroundings. Your reaction times are hindered. Your just sort of capacity for kind of critical thinking and processing and analyzing is somewhat diminished. And so, this could, this poses danger to flight attendants where, like I said, if you're trying to, secure luggage in the overhead bins and you lift luggage that, you're tired and you can't, or you don't realize sort of how heavy it is. Maybe it's a two-person job because, some folks get pretty fast and loose with what they consider carry-on. Attendants could end up hurting themselves in the process of trying to lift those bags, or if checks on, they before flight takes off, they always go up and down the aisle, checking and pushing on the overhead compartment bins to make sure that the door is actually secured, because what you don't want happening is if, in flight, during takeoff or in flight, if you hit turbulence or while you're landing, for a door that's not actually secure to come open, and you have carry-on that weighs 30, 40 odd, what's the limit, like 30-ish pounds, 40-ish pounds, to come crashing down on people and hurting people, or if or other things too. Someone says I have a food allergy, notes to the flight attendant, and that gets forgotten again because of exhaustion, or any number of different things that may happen that are as the flight attendants are responsible for passenger safety and comfort. If they're exhausted, they're not able to do their job at their full ability, and so it makes for a less safe environment for passengers and for the attendants themselves. As well as in the case of an emergency, if an emergency landing is happening or what have you, and the pilots need the crew to prep the cabin for an emergency landing, or even just to get people buckled in if you're going to be going through turbulence. Again, if you're exhausted, you might forget the necessary steps that are needed in order to do any of these different sort of emergency procedures to keep people safe in the cabin, or to just follow instructions that may come from the pilots in a certain situation. So any number of different things, which also just comes down to like respect by management, where I forgot I had it linked here. And Clipchamp is opening for some reason. I had it linked in my document and I just fully forgot. So here's just kind of like a breakdown of this is from CUPE's Air Canada Component, and they just sort of noted here in a bargaining survey that they did, during the process of of this labor action. The number one concerns or issues from flight attendants. So 91% said unpaid work. So this is like what we talked about how when the plane's on the ground, they're not getting paid for any of the work that they're doing. 88% wages and cost of living, which is also what we talked about. Scheduling and fatigue, 72%, and then feeling respected by management, 41%. And this relates to, this is sort of what is defined down here by CUPE. If you feel disrespected by management or that the company isn't walking the talk on safety. So again, this would be like being compelled to work in a hot airplane cabin. The airplane hasn't been turned on yet, so the engines aren't running, which means there's no airflow coming into the cabin. That could be it, or just, if there is a passenger who is, who the flight attendants feel is a safety risk to passengers and crew, that's rowdy or violent or just disrespectful in some way, or is potentially intoxicated in some way that poses a risk to everyone on the flight, when flights first started running again post COVID lockdowns, if they felt here comes someone on the plane who is quite obviously ill, and if flight attendants would be, the crew is relying on that if they make a decision where someone is unfit to be on that flight, that if they deny them boarding or deboard them, that management would back them up, sort of thing. And so if management if they don't feel that management's backing them up, or there's not a culture of trust, in terms of the decisions actually made on the plane by the folks actually working there on the plane, that makes for an unsafe situation where any kind of situation that could be a safety risk is not dealt with because of fear of reprimand or repercussions, whether it's loss of hours or who knows, being put on less desirable flight routes. I don't know sort of specifically how reprimand might look in this situation, but for fear of any kind of reprisal reprimand from the company, they're not going to necessarily deal with that issue, or it makes it a lot harder to deal with that issue. What's probably more likely as well is if they feel that the company is taking advantage in some way, in addition to just the frankly abysmal compensation structure. But if they're not being properly comped meals or accommodation, or they're not being allowed, or they're being compelled to, or they're overscheduled, or that kind of thing. Again, that kind of thing happens in a culture that's fostered by a company where any sort of pushback or criticism of the company is handled, with hostility, with some kind of reprimand, de-empowering workers to actually, speak up or, address concerns going on in the workplace, whether it's regarding safety or just, ostensibly exploitative labor practices. And then 34% said that a main concern of theirs is safety and security, which we kind of covered. They're talking about respect by management. But of course, the number one thing is pay, which makes sense. Of course, it's pay. That is, and frankly, I was surprised about kind of how poorly airline attendants are compensated, given the amount of work that they have to do, and just for how many consecutive hours they have to do it. I already kind of hate being on a plane as a passenger, and my job is just to sit there and chill until I get to my destination. I can't imagine what it's like working and having to serve people on a plane. I have great respect for what flight attendants do, and to see that they are so poorly compensated for that work, it's just shocking. And then, naturally what we're going to see as well, if you haven't already seen, is just in the, in the news, the discussion is not going to be about, why are flight attendants so poorly compensated, overworked, and that their wages are nowhere near to keeping up with the cost of living. Where they're offering, I think it's like an 8% pay raise, but it would actually mean that for their wage to actually keep up with the cost of living, it would actually need to be raised about 9%, in order to keep pace with inflation, and so it's like, why isn't that happening? Why isn't that going on? And the story will, as always, ends up being about the disruption that this causes, and how inconvenienced we will all be, and sort of a kind of insidious blaming of the workers for this situation, and not for, and not blaming Air Canada, who actually holds all the power to set wages and schedules, etc. Because the thing is, if it's such a great disruption that, if it's such a great disruption for airlines to halt service because they don't have the required crew to service a flight, and it is, like we said, Air Canada is, one of our largest national carriers, and they are one of the largest foreign airline services to the U.S. Why aren't they compensated thusly? Why are they not paid the actual, value they're worth? Why are they not paid in a way that reflects how vital their work and labor actually is to the operation of critical infrastructure like commercial flight? So, I just always find that interesting, that the narrative is, demonizing the workers as opposed to the owners or the management, or the executives or whoever, the folks in power or who own the company, who own that particular that particular what am I trying to say, that particular that particular unit of production, I guess, for lack of a better term. And this is a way in which, folks always talk about how, news media is not about informing people. It's about maintaining a certain status quo, and, advocating the interests of capital and the interests of wealth. And this is a way that this sort of works in practice. Whereby the reason why airline attendants in this case are not fairly compensated for the value that they provide to Air Canada through their labor is because of the profit motive. Profit only is achieved when workers are paid less than the value of their actual work. Which is what wage theft is, because you are generating, in this case, an airline attendant is generating, X value. If you wanted to, think about it in terms of the market share of, the airline market share in Canada or North America that Air Canada has, and then divide that by the number of airline attendants that there are working for Air Canada. So setting aside all the other necessary workers like pilots and mechanics, maintenance crews, that kind of thing. I guarantee you that. Even if you did include also all the other necessary labor that goes on to just keep an airline running, like the actual on the ground labor to keep an airline running, to keep the planes in service, I guarantee you that money is not is more than that piece of the pie. It would be more than what they're actually being paid right now, because. Or even just for the fact of you don't pay for when you're buying a ticket for a flight, you're not paying you're not buying it at cost. Obviously you are being charged a markup, and sometimes it's just disguised as fees and fees or service fees or what have you. That is just a markup for that. It just goes towards the profit margin of the actual airline company, because that's the mode of production we're in under capitalism. Is companies, Air Canada is not in the business of flying planes. Air Canada is in the business of making money. As is true for any company. Rolls-Royce is not in the business of making jet engines. They're in the business of making money. It's just whichever particular vertical they kind of find themselves in. But they're all in the business of making money. But of course, that's not a narrative that is that the true narrative is not one that's beneficial to the capitalist class or the managerial class. There has to be this illusion of there's some kind of value. There has to be the illusion of fair market prices, or that that the market is always in a perfect equilibrium, or it's a perfect zero sum game. It's a perfect it's an economic alchemy, or it's a perfectly equivalent exchange of money for goods and or services. But the fact is, if that were true, we wouldn't be in the position in the first place where, in this case, airline attendant, the Air Canada might be halting service. Our major national air carrier and international carrier is halting service because their attendants will be going on strike because they're not being paid, whether not being paid properly or in some cases not being paid at all for the work that they're doing. That's why they're not being paid. In really simple, crude terms, that's why they're not being paid for the work they're doing on the ground, because that's less money Air Canada has to pay to those workers. If they can say, well, you're an airline attendant and you're supposed to be working your job is servicing a flight, and if you're on the ground, you're not flying, and thus it's not a flight, and thus those aren't working hours. And so we're not compensating that. Which in crude terms is just, as with any corporation or company, their objective is always to find a way to pay the workers, pay you or me, as little as they possibly can, so that their profit margin can remain as large as it possibly can. It's more expected from an airline, a private for-profit business. It's still wrong. It's more expected. It's much more frustrating to see happen, and much more enraging to see happen with something like Canada Post, which is an arm of our government, which is not supposed to be run for profit, because that's just not government agencies or government public services are not for-profit endeavors. They are first and foremost public service that is supposed to be given in exchange for our payment of taxes. So that's kind of where things stand right now. So that's just to keep in mind when you're seeing any kind of news coverage about this, especially as we get closer to the weekend. I'm sure this is going to be, top of the headlines. Just watch for, when, when you're seeing this, in the Star and the CBC and any number of different news outlets, who's the, who is being posited as the problem here, who seems to be kind of the villain in the narrative in crude terms. Usually it will be the workers, because the job of the news media, at least the legacy news media, or the mainstream news media, if you want to call it that, its job is to advocate for the status quo as it benefits capital, as it benefits owners or executives or what have you, who directly benefit and make a living from collecting the profit of a given business. So that's where it stands right now. We'll see how long this goes. I wish Air Canada's flight attendants, all the best luck, and I hope that they get what they're asking for. I think it's good they're going on strike. The point of a strike is it's supposed to be disruptive, to make the injustice as hard as possible to ignore, and halting the service of a major airline is a pretty good way to do that. And so, all power to the Air Canada flight attendants, as with all power to the CUPE, to the postal workers and their negotiations with Canada Post, and to any and all workers who may be staring on the barrel of job action, whether strikes or lockouts. if these workers were just paid their proper value, you wouldn't have this happening. And that's all that's being asked for, is just fair compensation. And I think it's a pretty reasonable ask. So that's where we're going to cut it for today. It's we're in a little over time. It's 12:40 Eastern, 12:40 Eastern, 9:40 Pacific. And we're going to switch over now. We're going to close it there for today. And in just a moment, we'll flip over to the majority report. We're going to take a last look now at the live cam from the CN Tower. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I hope you all have a good weekend. Like I mentioned, just keep an eye on if you have flights coming up, keep an eye on the situation as it pertains to the strike, the Air Canada strike, and avoid any strenuous activity outside today. It looks like there has been some more smoke in the forecast. We're sitting at 77 Fahrenheit right now, so mid to upper 20s Celsius. Hope you have a good weekend. We'll see you back here Tuesday at 11. Thank you so much for watching. Bye-bye.